Welcome to Just Liberty, where justice and liberty meet. I'm Alan Reinach, Executive Director of the Church State Council, and I'm here with my co-host Bettina Krause, editor of Liberty Magazine. And together, we're trying to recover religious liberty from the political extremes. Well, today, Bettina, before we get to our guest, I wanted to talk to you about the number one issue in religious accommodation.
Okay,
If
I'm
you
on the edge of my seat here. The number one issue, Alan.
The number one issue. So, the EEOC, the United States Equal Employment Opportunity Commission, maintains data on the number of discrimination charges filed every year. And in 2022, you may not be surprised to learn that religion cases went from about 3 or 4% on average any given year to more than almost 19% of the total complaints filed with the Civil Rights Agency. And that the footnote says it's all COVID related. There are basically thousands of people complaining about losing their jobs because they would not get vaccinated and having articulated religious reasons. And
Yeah.
what these cases will often really turn on is, well, was somebody's objection truly religious or not? And how do we determine that? And how intrusive can employers and courts be in telling somebody, well, yours is not a real religious belief, it's really something else?
And it was a significant part of our 2022 experience because of this huge uptick in religious exemption claims. But the courts have been dealing with this issue for decades. And correct me if I'm wrong, Alan, but the stance that most courts have taken in the past is that they don't inquire too closely into what actually is a legitimate religious belief or practice. They accept on faith, as pun intended,
Or at face value.
on face value, the assertion of the person who's claiming that religious belief.
Well, they're certainly not allowed to say your belief is true or false.
Right.
Right? That's not the province of the courts, and they're very good about that. But especially in the context of prisoner cases, the prisons have been really brutal at trying to disqualify people's religious, sincerity and saying, well, you're not entitled to a kosher meal, you're not entitled to this or that because, you ate something that wasn't kosher once.
But I mean, you can understand the court's reluctance to inquire too deeply into this because, it's not the role of a civil authority to inquire into a religious belief. But when you have that surge of claims, I'm a strong proponent of religious freedom and protecting that legally, but in the face of sort of this overwhelming surge in claims, it almost feels like the courts need to have some metric for understanding or sorting through these claims. Surely not all of them are religiously motivated, right?
So on that point, there has been some very good research showing that when the religious exemption is the only way parents can, opt out of school vaccinations, that they will invoke that regardless of whether they have a religious belief or not. Our staff screened hundreds of folks who wanted help with religious accommodations, religious exemptions to the vaccine. And yeah, we found that there were many who had other reasons for not wanting the vaccine, other than religion. So that's certainly true that, there are people with very varying degrees of religious sincerity or varying reasons for having opted out.
So then, Alan, the $1 million question is, what is the court to do with all of this? How do you feel that the current approach is sufficient, or does the court need greater ability to delve into what is or isn't a religious belief?
So I think the biggest problem that we're seeing is the willingness of both employers and courts to evaluate religious beliefs and their sincerity without hearing from the individual.
True.
So, since if you think about it, sincerity of belief is a credibility issue. And how do you determine somebody's credibility unless you talk to them? You know, our staff, we were able to talk with, dozens, hundreds of people. And after a few minutes conversation, we had a pretty good idea whether they had a real religious objection or something else. And too many employers, fired people that they never even talked to see if their religious belief was genuine and sincere, or never even asked their supervisors what they thought, the people who actually worked with them, right, and supervised them. And too many courts are willing to just throw these cases out without ever giving the person a chance to testify. And so I think that's where we're finding a real threat to religious freedom here.
Well, I think it's also exposed a friction point, and it's one I think that is going to come up again and again in the future. And I'm pretty sure we're going to be talking about it in future programs. But for now, let's move on to our interview for the day. And I'm really interested to hear what our guest has to say. Michael, welcome to Just Liberty Podcast. We're so glad you're here.
So glad to be with you. Thank you for having me.
So we are delighted to have Michael Ware with us for an interview for the Just Liberty podcast. He's a nationally renowned political consultant, a speaker, an author. He's the founder and president and CEO of the nonpartisan organization Center for Christianity and Public Life. He also served in the Obama White House and led faith outreach for the campaign. And his first book, Reclaiming Hope, was a reflection of his experience during those years. But what I'm excited to talk to him about today is his most recent book, which has just been released. It's called The Spirit of Our Politics, Spiritual Formation and the Renovation of Public Life. And I have to ask you, Michael, what led you to this topic? Why did you feel that this was something that you wanted to address?
Yeah, well, again, thank you for having me on. This book comes out of the conviction that I developed over my time in public service and in public life, that the kind of people we are has much to do with the kind of politics and public life that we have. That, yes, the structures are vital. Public policy is important. I've spent my life on public policy questions, but I've become convinced that lasting change in a positive direction can only emerge from the kind of people who could sustain and direct and have the capacity to desire and will that kind of change. And so the Center for Christianity and Public Life is grounded in the idea that spiritual formation is central to civic renewal, and this book is an expression of that.
I love that, Michael, and I've been kind of smiling and snickering as I'm listening to you, because one of Bettina's and my colleagues has often said that Americans get the politicians we deserve, and of course that's a stunning rebuke if you think that our politicians are less than stellar and worthy. I guess my question in reading over and I haven't had a chance to read the book, but I've read one of your interviews and all is, are you writing this book for the religious left or the religious right, or is it do you really see it as being relevant for the spectrum of the faith community?
Yeah, no, I mean, so spiritual formation is something that everyone has. Everyone has a spiritual formation. It's not something you opt into. It is something that you could actively participate in. And life with Jesus, the gospel, is growing into the likeness of Christ. The gospel is about the present availability of the kingdom and our ability to enter into it. So this book, I think it has broad civic implications for our civic life. And I hope that a broad range of folks will sort of listen in and gain what they can. I will say that this book, the heart of concern is for the church, broadly speaking. I think that we've been through a significant period of reacting to politics, and particularly presidential elections, and sort of being in a state of sort of crisis mode. My hope is that this book empowers Christians, and particularly pastors, to gain confidence in the resources that the Christian faith offers in our political life, that the way of Jesus actually holds up in all of life, including politics and public life. And my hope is that, especially as we go deeper into this year, we won't just have politics acting on the church and acting on our communities and acting on our families, but that we'll actually gain a vision for what positive contribution looks like that's in step with faithfulness to Jesus.
And that's an aspect which fascinates me, Michael, because, in the work that Alan and I do, we're often talking about Christian nationalism, and which is a destructive impact of, a distorted picture of religion on the body politic. And you're sort of counterintuitively urging Christians to jump on in, get into politics.
Yeah.
Help us understand what you're saying here, because we are so often told that Christianity is inherently corrupting for politics.
Yeah. So, as a citizen, you do not choose to have political influence. You already have it. And your choice is about how to steward the influence that you have. And I'll just say I'm quite reticent to lend the label of Christian nationalism to folks who are appealed to explicitly by a rejection of Jesus's teaching. I think progressive or even center-right Christians need to be very careful about what the public hears when we call Christian nationalism, when we refer to something as Christian nationalist, when it involves going into a church and telling that church, look, I know, and this is a paraphrase, but just barely, that, I know Jesus teaches that love your enemies stuff, and you could do that in your personal life, I guess, if you really feel strongly about it. But don't try that in politics. You'll get steamrolled. That stuff doesn't work in the practical area of politics. In politics, you need to secure. You need to go in and secure everything that you can for yourself, and then maybe you could be Christian in your personal life. I don't get the impulse to say that that's Christian nationalism. I have concerns about the leveraging of religious and Christian symbols, rhetoric to promote political violence or sort of anti-social behavior. But I'll say, from my point of view, the problem with Christian nationalism is not that it's too Christian, but that it's not Christian enough. That it doesn't will the good of it doesn't will the good of the public. It doesn't will the good of neighbor. It disrespects the inviolable dignity of each and every human person. And so that's my impulse here is So I had the opportunity to speak on the Hill to about 100 congressional staffers, and my talk was on rejecting anger in our politics and the viability of gentleness in public life.
I
Um,
love that. I love that.
and um, I, I think we need to be really careful about thinking and acting as if something like gentleness, doesn't work in politics. Well, guess what? Gentleness is the way of Jesus. And so you get very quickly to fundamental discipleship problems, not to mention the catastrophic implications for our public life when we think anger is how we get things done.
So, Michael, I'm struck by the challenge of urging Christians to apply their faith more diligently and effectively in our political life. And I'm mindful, one of the formative books for me was Chuck Colson's book, Kingdoms in Conflict. And one of the things that Colson, of course, famous Christian leader from, you know, convicted in the Watergate scandal, but he reported about how easily manipulated the religious leaders were by the Nixon administration and politicians in general, and the potential for just usurpation and corruption of the religious leaders as they seek to engage in politics. And I'm wondering, from your experience serving in the Obama administration, and how do we make sense of, on the one hand, yes, be more engaged, but on the other hand, we don't want to be corrupted or simply usurped in some way by a political party or politician.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's something that um, everyone, whether they're religious or not, has to be aware of. The easiest thing for our political candidates and political parties is to treat themselves as brands, as identity labels that then they get to fill in the meaning of what that brand means on a sort of iterative and convenient sort of basis. But that's not what our politics is. That's not what political parties are. Political parties aren't meant to be brands, identity labels. Political parties are meant to be vehicles for mediating disagreement, not just between the political parties, but within the party itself. And so Christians have, I think, unique resources to draw from that help us to understand that by participating in our politics, we don't cede our conscience to it. For Christians, we can come to understand that we can contribute great things to our politics, and we could learn wonderful things in our politics. But the dangerous thing is when we participate in politics with our feet planted in politics. But if we participate in politics with our feet planted in the gospel, all kinds of opportunities open up, and there are we can have a defense against the idolatries of our political age, which manifest in a whole range of sort of antisocial behaviors and norms. In my book, I talk about this model of this framework for thinking about the kind of polarization we have today called political sectarianism. And political sectarianism is, the social scientist said, it's a toxic cocktail of othering, aversion, and a misplaced moralization. And I think the Christian faith offers tremendous resources for undermining each three of those ingredients. But we need to actually take our faith seriously in order for that to happen.
I want to ask you about one particular narrative that we're getting from one end of the political spectrum, which is faith does not belong in the public space. The idea of separation of church and state is fundamental to our constitutional regime and how we protect religious liberty for all. But
yes,
from one end of the political spectrum, it seems that that is being interpreted in a way that faith, should just simply not be displayed either by candidates or by people who are stepping into the public space to advocate for public policy.
Yeah.
Talk to us about what's driving this narrative and how we as Christians can help counter that.
Yeah. Well, I should say this my new book, The Spirit of Our Politics, is in large part an application of the ideas of a philosopher by the name of Dallas Willard, a philosopher and Christian teacher by the name of Dallas Willard, applying his ideas around spiritual formation around the gospel to our public life and politics. Willard thought that the separation of church and state should be zealously upheld as a legal principle. But one thing that concerned him was the sort of philosophical suggestion that the legal principle tends to promote or can promote. I don't think it necessarily has to promote this, but it tends to promote this idea that religious or moral knowledge is not fit for public. Another person who's been influential in my life, Barack Obama, gave a speech in 2006 in which he said that attempts and demands that people of faith leave their faith outside of politics is, quote, a practical absurdity. And he said, imagine trying to remove religious influence from American history and social movements. Where would William Jennings Bryan go? What about Lincoln's second inaugural? King, Dorothy Day? And so I do think the legal principle of the separation of church and state has to be upheld. I also think that there are social norms that I think we need to consider when we're invoking religion in a pluralistic setting that aren't legal principles, but are part of being a good neighbor and that sort of thing. What that doesn't preclude, though, is people bringing their values and people bringing their full selves to our democracy.
Yeah, okay.
I don't know how you could promote democracy without that. I find it very interesting to have these sorts of appeals on one hand to democracy and civic participation and making your voice heard, and then these sort of very selective, motivated, unless you're religious, then you somehow need to cordon and quarantine that part of yourself and become a different person when you're in politics. And for a lot of people, that is, as Barack Obama said, a practical absurdity.
So I really liked what you said earlier about the problem with Christian nationalism is that it's not Christian enough, and I'm thinking about the interview that Russell Moore gave to NPR about his book, Losing Our Religion, and how many pastors were confronted if they would actually quote the teachings of Jesus in the Sermon on the Mount, and the objections that church members had to the teachings of Jesus. It's always struck me that on the one hand, no, we don't necessarily want the nation as such practicing the principles of the Sermon on the Mount. But as we as Americans relate to one another in a political way, we could probably do a lot better if we were paying closer attention, don't you think?
There is in the 90s there was a church movement. It was called the seeker-sensitive movement, and the idea was that you could sort of you could model church in such a way that it is particularly attractive to and responsive to the needs of people who are not yet sort of identifying and full participants in the life of the church, but are curious. They're seekers. In the spirit of our politics, I argue that we're seeing and have seen the emergence of politics-sensitive churches, churches actually organize, some churches organizing themselves to either attract or repel a certain kind of political political approach, or people who sort of have a certain kind of politics. And look, it's dangerous whenever the church is organized with something in the center other than Jesus. And there are a lot of things other than politics that we could organize our churches around. And politics is not the only idol out there, but it is one we need to be wary of.
I don't want to end on a negative note, so maybe we can maybe we can talk about some positive.
Well, I do just want to say, when Jesus is at the center holds.
Right.
That's been the experience that I've had in churches where I participate in the work that the Center for Christianity and Public Life does organizationally. We have cross-partisan, cross-denominational cohorts of fellows, which are remarkably, there's a remarkable mutuality to them. And it's because, for all of their differences, what they find is Jesus at the center of their lives and Jesus at the center of the community that they're building. And when that happens, that could be beautiful for those who are part of the community, but also a tremendous witness to those in the outside world. So that's the hope. It's the bad news is if we chase after a political vision of the church, then we'll be in a really tough place. The good news is that that's never been the intention of the church.
And that was the inspiring part of your book, because it does paint this vision for the contributions that Christianity can make to our politics, which is not something that we often think about. And I would encourage anyone listening to get a copy of the book and read it, especially during this election season. I think it's a timely read. So thank you so much, Michael, for being part of the podcast, and keep us updated on any other books coming down the pike.
Thank you so much. So good to be with you.
So, Bettina, I have all kinds of thoughts swirling around in my brain. One of them is, you had mentioned the notion that, there's no place for religion and politics, separation of church and state, and certain segment advocates that. Actually, I think that's the ultimate hypocrisy. Maybe not the ultimate, but the very, secular left that wants to kick, conservative Christians out of order are very happy with the role of the Black church and their advocacy for civil rights and for social justice issues. So it definitely is, a bit of hypocrisy operating where, and in fact, when I asked a Black civil rights leader at a social justice conference some years ago, what was the difference between how the Black church does politics and how the religious right does it, his answer was they stole our playbook.
Yeah.
So I think it comes down to what Michael was saying, which is that too many Christians doing politics these days are not Christian enough.
Yeah. Do you think it comes down to also fundamental attitudes, both from on the left and the right, that this sort of drive to remove dissenting viewpoints that make us uncomfortable, and the need to sort of make our public discourse pure in the sense that it aligns perfectly with whatever, political or religious orthodoxy I subscribe to? Where has gone the idea that we live in a genuinely pluralistic society where different points of view are accommodated, not because we agree with them, but because we preserve the right to disagree with them and for them to disagree with us?
Well, and I think this goes to one of the things that Michael discussed was the role of identity in politics, that instead of simply pursuing our values, our morality, our, being informed by our faith, that we now develop our sense of identity in association with political parties. And that is he didn't specifically call that out as a form of idolatry, but I think a lot of thoughtful Christians are seeing idolatry in many places, and Michael certainly does.
Oh, absolutely. And you see studies that come out showing that someone's identification with a political party trumps any other interests they have or any other identity marker that they have, whether it's their religion or it's their ethnicity or even their economic interests. They will vote against those interests because they've identified their team, and it's sort of this reflexive identification. I think you're right. It's a very appealing picture he paints, though, for Christianity actually helping to heal American polarization. How practical do you think that is, Alan?
Oy, I wish.
Yeah.
I mean, at least in theory, the gospel has the potential, if we would really live it out,
Yeah.
to build bridges. But it also, I wish I could be more optimistic.
We have to be less human. We have to be more Christian and giving in less to our human tendencies.
Well, part of the problem that we face, and we'll have to discuss this at much greater length on future shows, is that the most effective fundraising tool, the most effective organizing tool is very much not consistent with the gospel or the Christian faith. It is fear. And as long as, fear is what makes our politics go round, Christian influence is going to have an uphill battle.
Okay, so on that very positive note, we'll sign off. So this has been Just Liberty, where justice and liberty meet. I'm Bettina Krause with Alan Reineck, and until next time, remember, eternal vigilance is the price of liberty.